Hello, and welcome to Media-eval, a medieval pop culture podcast, where we talk about how medieval and medieval-inspired movies, TV, and books depict the medieval world. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what do they tell us about how modern people see the medieval past? I'm Sarah Ifft, a medieval historian, and today I'm joined by another medieval historian, Dana Wessell Lightfoot, to talk about The Lions of al-Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay. So hello, welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm as you said, I'm a professor of medieval history, and I teach at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, Canada. And like you, I'm also, my area of expertise is in medieval Spain. This type of that I'm really interested in studying is thinking about the experiences of those that most perceive as powerless in medieval Spanish history. And my goal as a scholar is to really challenge that narrative, to show that such people did have agency over their lives. So my current work is with Alexander Garrison. It's a collaborative project on Jewish women and conversas in the late medieval, late 14th and early 15th centuries. So I'm really excited to talk about this book.
Yes. So why did you especially want to talk about this book?
So I first read this book when it came out in the mid-1990s, in 1995, when I was just finishing my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. And that was right at the end of my undergraduate degree that I was introduced to medieval Spain. So it really wasn't till late on. And Guy Gavriel Kay is a Canadian author. He's written a lot of books in the realm of historical fantasy. And I think it's really important to bring attention to his work because he writes really interesting stories. Plus, there aren't very many historical fantasy or historical fiction books that are focused on medieval Spain. So it's another thing. And also, I think it's good to bring some Canadian content to your podcast. Yes. So I'm excited about that too.
Yeah, definitely. Glad to have some Canadian content and glad to have more Iberian content than we usually have. As a scholar of the medieval Iberian Peninsula as well, I'm often a little disappointed that I have to spend so much time talking about England on this podcast.
Yeah, I know. What is it with people representing medieval history and England, right? It's always about England. It's like there's nowhere else, and maybe France, occasionally France.
Right. It's like, England isn't the most interesting place in the Middle Ages, right? Like, you could do better.
Yeah, there's much more fascinating stories to be told.
Yeah, and I think this is a very good example of that. And and as you said, Guy Gavriel Kay has this really interesting history as a fantasy author of writing these essentially historically inspired fantasy. So this is the first time I'd read this was for the podcast, but I'd previously read his Sailing to Sarantium. He has a pair of books which is inspired by the Byzantine Empire, focuses on Justinian and Theodora. Maybe one day I'll be in the mood to do that for the podcast.
Yeah.
If I do a reread. But yeah, so he has this really kind of interesting focus in some ways that's different from a lot of fantasy authors.
Yeah, and his most recent book is set in a sort of flipped late medieval Italy and looks at the Italian Wars, which is also really, really fascinating. And then I should bring some attention to a trilogy that he did called the Fionavar Tapestry.
Yes.
Which is sort of a moving through time, right? A time travel kind of a series of books, which are also really, really wonderful too.
I read those years ago, and if I'm remembering correctly, the heroes are actually grad students.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Grad students never get to be the heroes.
Yeah, I know. It's and again, also a series of wonderful stories. I saw them on my bookshelf the other day, and I thought I haven't read those it's probably been about 15 years. So I think I might go back and reread them because they're also really great. Again, and I think he has this really great way of bringing attention to stories that are often not told in the broader public, right? Of different types of people, of looking at different parts of history in a new way, and none of his books focus on England at all. So
yes, it's great. With that, let's get into the plot in the first section, which I call the enumeratio. So I'm going to give just a very brief recap of essentially the premise to orient us, and then we can get into some of the details.
Sure.
The Lions of al-Rassan takes place in al-Rassan, a fractured kingdom inspired by medieval al-Andalus. It follows the intertwined narratives of three central figures of three different faiths: the Kindoth physician Jahan, analogous to the Jews, the Jadeite or Christian-ish military commander Rodrigo Belmonte, and the Asharite or Muslim poet, diplomat, and soldier Ammar ibn Khayran as they navigate the fall of al-Rassan and their relationship with one another and with the assorted kings vying for control of the peninsula of Esperania. Yeah, so that's essentially where we start off.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of backstory, I would say, that we begin with, in terms of our kind of political intrigue, in terms of our kind of interreligious conflict, that some of this is things that will be familiar to those who are familiar with the actual history of the Iberian Peninsula, in terms of that it used to be fully under Jaddite control. It was then conquered by the Asherites, and now there are these kind of little Jaddite kingdoms in the north.
Yeah, and the Jaddite kingdoms kind of seem to fight with each other as much as they seem to have conflict with the Asherites in the south. And so all of that is kind of set up for us at the beginning, and also the backstory of like how they ended up with al-Rassan splintered into these into the prologue features an assassination of the ruler of the united al-Rassan. And that's what creates these splintered kingdoms, is the death of this particular ruler. And of course, one of our main characters is introduced to us right at the prologue as the agent of that. So the whole beginning of the book is really setting up where these three characters come from, right? The context for each of them, and then bringing them all together with particular moments is the kind of the goal.
Yeah, we have Ammar, who is the assassin of the last caliph. We also then have an interesting connection in that the person for whom he essentially did this for, al-Malik of Qartada, he is essentially responsible for a major crisis in Jahan's life, in that we learn that his concubine was having a difficult childbirth, ended up having to have a C-section, which was performed by Jahan's father Ishaq. And that because he had therefore then laid eyes on the naked body of an Asharite woman, he was blinded and his tongue cut out.
Yes. And then as a result of that, his daughter Jahan then steps into his medical practice and becomes sort of the supporter of their family in some ways, although it sounds like her father was kind of financially compensated for his actions in preventing the death of the mother and child in that way as well. And so that's sort of where we see her begin, right, is in the market in Fizana. And she's really fascinating. I love Jahan as a character in so many ways, but it's through her connection to a particular client or patient that she has that she's first introduced to Ammar, and prevents that particular client from being massacred. Once again, Ammar is in the middle of all of this intrigue that's happening too. It's really interesting because he always seems to be in the middle of those particular types of intrigue, right? And then he's able to extricate himself in various ways. So we start and then once again there's assassinations that are happening, but in this case he's not the one carrying them out. He's sort of a pawn in the hands of this ruler who he helped get to the throne.
Right. And that it seems like part of it is that essentially that al-Malik, the ruler, is concerned about his level of power and wants to undermine him and wants to essentially both accomplish this purge of the city leadership of Fezana, but also basically have it be blamed on Ammar.
Yes. Yeah. Because again, I guess he's concerned with himself, with Ammar having too much power because of this, his connection to the fact that that's how al-Malik came to power himself. So it's a kind of a way of dressing him down, I guess, in some ways.
Right. And it's because of essentially the coincidence that this one man, a merchant, Husari ibn Musa, that he had, kidney stones?
Yes, kidney stones. Yeah. Yeah.
That he happened to have kidney stones that day, and Jahan was brought to treat him. And because he was being treated for kidney stones, that's why he was not included in this massacre.
Yes. Yeah. And Husari, of course, goes on to become a kind of an important side character, right? His own story is really fascinating because he's a Muslim, and then he goes with Jahan and gets caught up in the Jaddite army, and then becomes a follower of one of the Jaddites himself. So his story is also kind of in the background too, that alongside these three main characters.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate how practical and how active Jahan is. That,
Mhm.
she makes the decision relatively quickly, both that she's going to leave, but also that she's not going to leave without also helping Husari to leave with her.
Yes. Yeah, to make sure that he gets out as well,
Yeah.
right? And she's also concerned about her family and making sure that her parents are protected, but aware that for them to travel is a very different thing, right? That they're older, and with her father being blind, that for him it's a much more challenging thing. And so off she goes with Husari, and then of course runs into Rodrigo.
Yes, so runs straight into Rodrigo Belmonte, who has been exiled. This will, as we'll talk about later, might sound familiar to those of you familiar with El Cid, and to some respect. But that, yes, he was exiled for, what was it, some kind of conflict between him and the king's
constable.
One of the other, the king's constable.
Yeah, one of the Dorada family who seem to dislike him greatly, and continually attempt to do things to his family.
Yes, that really seems to be their main just hobby, I guess.
Yeah, apparently the only thing that the constable for this particular king has to do is to bother the Belmonte family in different ways.
Right. Yeah, so because of this, he has left his the kingdom that he is based in, Valledo, and is now kind of runs into Jahan at this point.
Yeah.
What ends up happening is that they end up then all three of them ultimately being based in another city of, now I've forgotten what the name of the city is, and I have to, Ragosa.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, I guess, supposed to be Zaragoza.
Yes, I think it's based on Zaragoza, yeah.
Yeah. Although there are kind of moments here and there where it almost sort of seemed like some of those descriptions, I was kind of wondering if there's like a little bit of Valencia sneaking in there, but I think it's mostly supposed to be Zaragoza.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And so here they end up, all three of them end up working together as a mercenary army for the king of Ragosa, who also happens to have a Kindith advisor, Mazur Ben Avrin, who's also a really interesting character. I'm pretty sure based on Samuel ibn Nagrila.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, there they have Jahan is not only a member of this mercenary army, the doctor for the army, but she also has a position at court with Mazur, working as a physician there as well, and is really becomes important in terms of protecting the concubine of the Ashurite, of another Ashurite king who comes to Ragosa asking for protection because her sons are located there as well.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening with the Ashurites is that al-Malik I, who is the one for whom essentially Ammar had assassinated the caliph, he then, in part because of this purge, Ammar then joins forces with al-Malik's son, al-Malik II, which I appreciate the realism of that. It's going to make this more inconvenient to discuss, but I do appreciate always when they acknowledge the fact that, everybody has the same name in the Middle Ages. So it's that. So the two of them then conspire to assassinate the father. And al-Malik II is now king, and his first act as king is to exile Ammar.
Yeah, and Ammar also realizes the fact that al-Malik I's concubine, Zahira, is in danger, as are her sons, who could challenge al-Malik II for the throne. And so he helps to ensure that she can escape. And so she also goes to Ragosa and is an important player in that court as well. She ends up having a relationship with Mazur Ben Avrin as well.
Yes.
But also she's shown as a very politically astute woman, right? Aware of the fact that she does have this power, that there are people who want to see her children, her two sons, killed. And so that she's going to use what she has available to her in order to protect them. And she's also, much like Jahan, but in a very different way, a very active woman, right? A woman who has power and influence and knows how to use it, right? Knows how to do that. And so she's very involved in kind of what's going on at that court and making sure that her children are okay.
Yeah. And I will note as well that I think it's important to acknowledge that The book is in a lot of ways very, I mean, it's not explicit or anything, but it's very kind of casually sex positive.
Yes.
At least in the sense that, the women are both presented as being sexually active, both in relationships that are clearly meaningful and romantic, but also more casually.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's not something that's ever, that they're ever denigrated for.
Yes. And there's also an emphasis on the fact that sexual assault against women is wrong, right? You see male characters who condemn that type of action by armies and who actually work to prevent it from happening. But also you have these characters who are female who clearly take the lead in sexual relationships too. There's the wonderful storyline between Alvar and the cat in Carnival, right? Where this woman clearly sees what she wants and she goes for it, right? And I really like that fact about this book as well, that women are not presented as simply these victims in terms of sexual assault, as we often see with so many things said in the medieval period. That women have choice and consent is important, but also that men will defend women in that, right? That they aren't simply complicit in sexual violence too, which I think is important.
Yeah, it's the one thing I will say is, of course, to some extent, it is the trope that it's the bad guys are the ones who are very casual about sexual assault being acceptable, and then the good guys are the ones who no, never, and we of course have to vociferously defend against that.
Yes,
which not saying it should be the other way around, of course.
Yeah,
but it is.
But doesn't necessarily reflect reality for sure. Yeah.
But I will say the other thing I appreciated is that you have men defending against this, but also that there are some instances where we see women able to defend themselves. I mean, I really loved the scene where the constable's brother goes to essentially attempt to probably rape and murder Rodrigo's wife, Miranda Belmonte, and kill their children. That seems to be his goal there. And she's actually the one who kills him.
Yes. Yeah. Again, so I mean, showing that these women are not shrinking violets, right? And that they have lots of different tools at their disposal to defend themselves and their families.
Yeah, so they're really interesting figures. And the other thing I will say is that I think the characters are for the most part really interesting in that. And there's a lot of people. It's a big cast of characters.
Yes.
There are people who are often on not the same side of various conflicts, but there are relatively few people who are just evil or uncomplicatedly villainous.
Yeah. And the characters in general, I think, are really fully developed in terms of thinking about them as fallible, right? They're all, that's one of the things that I love about Kay's work, is that all of his characters are always fallible. Right? Yeah. They all are human. And so you feel some connection with them, because you can kind of see that they're just like normal people, right? They're these great heroes who have no faults, that they all of them, regardless of who they are. And I mean, there's clearly evil, bad characters and good characters, right? I think that's sort of what ends up happening regardless, but that all of them have some really interesting qualities within them that help us think about them as real.
Yeah, that they're all very realistic. I would say even a number of the kings, while you certainly don't, I would say, like them per se, you have a sense of the concerns that are motivating them, and the fact that it is a complex web of concerns, and that even when they do things that are bad, that are awful, they almost never seem just completely just like irredeemable, horrific people.
Yes. Yeah. And that they understand that there's consequences for their actions, right? I mean, when Amalik II kills his father and then banishes Amar, he realizes fairly soon that was kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And that there's consequences for him having done that. In terms of his own ability to rule and to exert his influence and power, right? He realizes very quickly, well, maybe I was actually better off with having him at my side rather than as someone against me, right? Or fighting for other people.
And even Amar, I mean, he's one of our central figures. He will become a love interest for Jahan as well, but he's introduced to us as a murderer.
Yes. Yes.
It's not entirely clear for a little while whether or not he was deliberately involved in some capacity in the Fizana massacres.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a while for us to kind of figure all of that out. And he's an interesting character because on the one hand, he's this kind of poet and diplomat, right? So he's very good with words and with thinking intellectually in that way, obviously very cultured, very well educated, but he's also very dangerous. And people are afraid of him, right? I mean, you get that sense that people are afraid of him and respect his ability in that way. And that part both those things are seen as being able to work together. Both those halves are seen as being able to work together as a character. He's also, at points you don't really like him. Like there's some of the things that he does that I'm like, no, like I don't. The fact that you did that, but that's okay, right? And I think, I mean, I like that Kay is confident enough as an author to say that that's okay, right? You're not going to like, we don't like as human beings, we don't like everybody all the time. And so, to have his characters do things that you don't like is okay for him.
Yeah. And that you can ultimately still have characters who are sympathetic and in many ways likable, who still make choices that you fundamentally disagree with.
Yes. Yeah. Which I think is important, if you're going to read a book, that's what I think a good book, right? These are the type of qualities that it's going to have in it.
Yeah. And so that's definitely something else that I appreciated. They're based in the city of Ragosa, and it's while our three main figures are based there, that we essentially start on the path which will end in this book kind of very rapid progression of what is analogous to the Christian conquest of the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes, very quickly.
Yes, and we'll talk about this later, but it must all take place basically within 30 years?
Something like that, yeah.
So it's very quick.
Very rapid timeline, yeah.
Yes. We learned, so there are these clerics from Ferrieres, which is France, I guess.
Yeah.
They are urging the Jaddite kings of Esperania to join forces and fight against the Asherites, while at the same time there has recently begun basically the Crusades, a Jaddite holy war against the kingdom of Amuz, as it is referred to in
the East, right?
In the East, yes. Yeah.
And then also within the Jaddite kingdoms as well, there's this undercurrent of increasing intolerance and critique of the Kindith, people of the Kindith faith as well. So there's a certain element within their leadership too, which are promoting attacks against them or removing them from their kingdoms as well. And so that kind of anxiety underplays all of this too.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting ways that gets dealt with. One of the things I found really striking is so that there's some Jaddite queen, long deceased at this point, whose name I do not remember, but that she is somebody who is venerated as a saint. And, we even have Alvar de Polino talking about the fact that, his mother went on pilgrimage to her shrine.
Yeah.
And then we also have Jahan talking about, what she thought about the Kindath and her, intense hostility. And I really liked how that was dealt with, because I think especially it's something that I often find very frustrating in some ways. I mean, when talking to people who are not necessarily as familiar with Jewish history about the medieval past, that there's figures who are often kind of idealized and even almost venerated without acknowledging that very kind of ugly part of their past and history as well.
Yes, yeah, and the fact too that Alvar was kind of unaware of that, right? Like that and Jahan introduced, and it made him rethink that, right? And also made him rethink about his mother's belief in this, and I thought that was a really interesting moment too. And again, I think, that having this queen that's venerated, but also has this particular side of her that, promotes intolerance and violence against this minority faith. I think it's reflective of the reality of humanity, right? That you can have these people that are venerated, but who also do really awful things. It's important to understand both halves of those people.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so obviously a figure who's, much later than this particular queen is meant to have been, but it's in some ways to me kind of interestingly parallel some of the ways you see people talking about Isabella of Castile.
Yes.
who, of course is, a central figure responsible ultimately for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, but who, you often get this kind of like girl boss, powerful queen narrative surrounding her.
Yeah, and she's venerated as kind of the the one that supported Columbus and his voyages, and the leader.
Which of course, problematic for other reasons.
Yes, for other reasons, right? Yeah, but venerated by certain groups, people for that, and also her involvement in the conquest of Granada as well.
Yeah,
she's seen particularly in modern Spanish society today. She's really venerated, but there's this other side of her that's really and much like the same queen who's I also can't remember, but yeah, the same thing, right? And so I think you see those undercurrents of within these Jadeite courts, but also within the Asharite court too, right? And I think that's one of the things that I like too, is that Kay shows that intolerance is not specific to a particular faith.
Yes. Yeah. And it's, and I thought it was really interesting the way that it actually even kind of very overtly acknowledged the fact that we have Al-Malik II talk about essentially, well, I'm kind of stirring up some kind of discontent and anger toward the Kindath. And Amar is like, what are you doing that for? And he basically says, make me popular, I guess.
Yeah. That this is a political move, right? That it's not that his choice to do this is not out of religious intolerance, but out of a desire, out of other desires, right? Out of other for other reasons. And I think that's important too, to highlight the fact that this type of interfaith violence isn't always motivated by religion, right?
Yeah, and
there are other motivations.
Yeah. And that there's a real pragmatism and a pragmatism that cuts both ways, right? I mean, on the one hand, we hear these kings, the Jadeite kings, talking about, well, I mean, we're going to be tolerant of the Asharites and maybe even the Kindath because we need people to continue to, stay and work the fields.
Yeah.
And so as I said, there's this pragmatism that sometimes can result in toleration seeming like the right thing to do, and that can be beneficial. And sometimes that same instinct toward pragmatism is something that ultimately will lead toward real violence. As what happens in Ragosa eventually. Yeah, and so we see that there's we have massacres that take place against the Kindath perpetrated by people of both faiths. More distantly, we hear that the crusading Jadites en route to Amuz have stopped in Cyrenaica, which is a Jewish city in essentially Italy. Yeah, and massacred the Kindath there, and at close to the same time in Fizana that there is a massacre in the Jewish quarter there
as well. Yeah, and that these are seen as connected together too. I think. Yeah, done by different groups, but there's a connection to them. And at the same time, of course, we have this group of Asharites from the desert, from the Mahriti desert, and the Merwadis, who are already present in al-Rassan as working as mercenary soldiers. They're the ones that carry out this massacre, political massacre, I guess, in Fizana. But then they also arrive in greater numbers. So there's a whole storyline with the main characters from the leaders of this particular group as well, debating whether or not they're going to invade al-Rassan and how they view. So very, very much clearly, designed to reflect the Almoravids and the Almohads. Yeah. Blended all together. Yes. Right. Yes. And they have connections at court themselves, right, as well. Yeah. And so that's another storyline of another political group that's kind of on the outside that's going to come in and also influence the story that gets to be told. Right. Yeah. And really emphasizing the kind of multifaceted nature of how things are changing in the groups that are involved in that. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I like about this book is that, medieval Spanish history is really complicated, and I think some of the one of the reasons why some people don't teach it in their classes and don't read about it is because it is complicated. But Kay does a really good job of showing it can be complicated, but you can craft a narrative out of it. Absolutely, that it all works together. Right, that you can see those complexities and all of these difficult things that are going on and think about them, but you can write a story about this, right? That has a strong storyline and that has a narrative you can hang on to and that has characters that you can associate with, despite its complexity, which I I think it's important for us to think about as readers, just as readers of fiction.
Yeah, and there is of course, as we'll talk about as we get into the next section, we'll talk about at some point, the fact that there of course are things that are oversimplified, events that are condensed. Yes. But yeah, that as you said, he can still create a coherent narrative that even while making those choices, I think remains aware of that complexity and includes that complexity still.
Yeah.
And it certainly helps that he's somebody who's kind of good at writing that kind of political intrigue too. But.
Yes, very much so. And despite the fact that there's all these characters, I should highlight too, it's actually fairly easy to keep track of all of them.
Yeah. Like, unlike, they have very distinct personalities.
There's some in Game of Thrones, it's often hard to keep, there's so many characters, it's often hard to keep track of all of them. But here there's lots and lots of characters too, but because he's so good at crafting them as people, it's easy to keep track of them, I think.
Yeah, and so I really appreciate that. And I will say I also appreciate that there are, within the three faiths, there are more and less sympathetic people, I would say, certainly among both the Asherites and the Jadites. Among the Kindath, I would say there's nobody sort of really villainous, and it's kind of in this interesting dynamic that, of course, with both the Kindath in this book and the Jews in reality, tended not to be powerful enough, at least to be kind of carrying out these extreme acts of violence.
Yes.
But I think Mazer is an interesting figure in that he's ultimately a sympathetic figure, but he is somebody who, when we first meet him, I definitely kind of was like, I don't know if this is a trustworthy person.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when you're first introduced to him, he's presented as someone who clearly is very involved in all these political and pulling these strings in the background, right? And some of the things he's done seem kind of questionable. And the way that the main character Jahan approaches him too is that way, right? She's not quite sure how to deal with him and what is expected of her.
Yeah, Diane. So I really did appreciate that as well, right? Is that he too is, I think, somebody he's not an unambiguously positive figure, even if ultimately he is a sympathetic one.
Yes. Yeah.
So we have this kind of very dramatic climax in which, we have this massacre in Fezana, and Amar and Rodrigo and Jahan all have this kind of like breakneck pace ride to Fezana. I think actually, and Alvar and Husari are there for that as well. Yes. They arrive essentially just in time to kind of barely manage to rescue her parents and maybe a couple other people, but not everybody, of course. We have a great kind of side bit with the prostitutes of Fezana, who Jahan has always been kind of friendly with and has treated them.
Yes.
And so they warn her parents, or they warn her mother, and they help them get out of the city.
Yes. Yeah. These prostitutes, some of whom are very young, right? They have kind of this secret knowledge of how to get in and out of the city, and so they help Jahan and her family escape so that they can escape this the violence, but also show a lot of. I found that they're very pragmatic. Sometimes we're inside the walls, sometimes we're outside of the walls, and that's okay. We just kind of roll with it, and there's this massacre happening, but we know how to protect ourselves, and we're going to protect you and help you get away as well.
Yeah, and speaking of the pragmatism, that they're also kind of they're very aware too of the pragmatism behind a lot of these decisions, right? That it's a kind of every now and then as a way to placate certain moralizing forces. The people in charge send them outside the walls, and then maybe they'll decide later to bring them back inside the walls.
Yeah, and that there's a door, right? There's a door in the wall that their customers can come in and out of, and that they can come in and out of. So they're good allies to have when this violence breaks out, because they know the ways to get out of the city safely. And but also the fact that they're loyal, right? They're loyal to Jahan, who's helped them and who's treated them with their various ailments that they've had. So they help her family get away.
Yeah, just as they're managing to get out. So Rodrigo has two children, has two sons who are twins, who have been kind of impressed into this war that the Jadites are now making on al-Rassan. One of them is a visionary
Yes.
he can at least like he can see things that are happening to members of his family and kind of help find them at least.
Yeah, and the knowledge of the fact that he has these abilities, his family cleric decides that this knowledge needs to be shared with the king. And so he writes to this cleric from Ferreras, who's at the court in Valledo, and tells him about this. And so eventually he's kind of scooped up and brought into the army as a means of assisting them in their war against.
And the mother kicks she kicks him out, which I kind of, that Miranda kicks him out, which I really sort of appreciated, that she's like, I'm not on board with this.
Yeah, the fact that you like convinced and the sons are kind of like, no, we need to go. And I mean, it's an interesting the relationship between the two boys is really interesting, because one is very protective of the other one, of the one who's the visionary, but also they think of this as a big adventure, right? They're off on this big adventure, and they have this kind of mission, I guess, behind what they're very much what a young boy thinks of war, right? That they're going to ride off. Yeah,
they're 14-year-old boys, and their father is a military commander. Yeah. So they have this kind of very particular sense of what war is like, and it seems fun to them.
Yes, and so they arrive, and so they're outside the walls as well, waiting with the army, and then they all kind of meet there, and then it becomes very clear that this kind of alliance between Rodrigo and Amar and Jahan, that this is going to start to become problematic, right? That there's these outside forces that are invading to allow them to be a team themselves as a mercenary army, that now their own kingdoms, their own faiths, where they're from, is going to work to pull them apart, right? And to make them to cause them to become to fight on opposite sides.
And one of the things that I find fascinating is that we see that basically immediately after this moment, which in some ways is this kind of moment of basically the best possible unity in some ways, that it's because of a warning from Amar that they're able to realize that this base is under attack. And because of that, they get there essentially just in time that Diego, who has been very severely injured, Jahan's father, Ishak, is able to save his life.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that he, and again, this kind of mixing of the importance of these three faiths working together to save the life of this boy, at the same time that these outside forces are kind of playing into pulling them all apart, right? And making this conflict worse.
Yeah. And so after all of this, Ramiro has, of course, unexiles Rodrigo and now makes him constable and invites Amar to join them. And Amar feels that he cannot do that, that he is instead going to go back and essentially is assuming that he's going to ultimately be fighting for the Muad'Dibs.
Yes. Yeah. Much to his chagrin, he doesn't really want to be.
They're not really his type of people, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And so he has to go back and kind of deal with what's going to happen there with him. And Jahan has to make a decision, right, about what she's going to do too.
Yeah. Yeah. And she does go with him.
Yeah.
And we have then this, there's been hints throughout the book, of course, that it's going to end up in a climactic duel between Amar and Rodrigo, which happens. And in a moment that was definitely like, well done, but also one of those just most like me, like kind of screaming at a book moments. He like really holds off on telling you what happened in the duel and who won.
Yeah, I know. The duel happens, and then he doesn't tell you who won at all. It ends, and then he jumps forward in time, like quite a bit of time.
Yes, jumps forward in time. Now we're hanging out in Sorenica, which has been rebuilt. Alvar has converted to Judaism.
Yes.
Adorable.
Yeah. And even the beginning of that chapter too is very much, he doesn't, because Alvar is converted and he talks about his wife, but they don't say who the wife is. So is the wife, is the wife Jahan? Like who's he married? And then all of a sudden,
especially because he's like, oh, my wife, a physician like her father who also trained me.
Yes, yeah. So it's pages and pages and pages into the epilogue when you finally meet the wife, Maria, who is obviously not Jahan, but who is the daughter of another famous physician from Cyrenaica. And then we now discover the elderly Amar, who's walking with a stick with his wife Jahan. And it is then that we learn that in fact Amar had defeated Rodrigo in that battle.
Right, but that interestingly, they're still in touch with his wife Miranda. That she's actually the one who writes them to tell them what has happened, which is that the Jadites have won. They have definitively conquered the entirety of the peninsula.
Yes, and the head of that army is Rodrigo's son, right? He's the one that's affected that battle, and then we kind of learn what happened, right? The fact that Amar was the Marwadis wanted to kill him, and eventually, but Amar was allowed to leave with Jahan and move to Cyrenaica, and which is where they're now living with their family,
right?
And that's kind of where we end up at the end of the book.
Yeah. So we have, this sort of happy ending for most of our central characters, except Rodrigo, I suppose.
Rodrigo.
But this kind of melancholy or bittersweet element as well. And that, despite, of course, having its own flaws, there's very much this kind of sense presented in the work of al-Rassan as a place that was in many ways kind of really special and that can't fully exist probably again anywhere else in some ways, and that has been lost.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, Amar is of course a poet as well, and so he presents this beautiful poem at the end of the novel, which is really a lament for the loss of al-Rassan. But I think I thought that having the letter from Miranda was kind of a nice touch, right, to show that despite the fact that Amar defeated Rodrigo, that this particular duel was seen as something that was motivated by outside forces and not something that she holds a grudge against him for. I mean, it's hard to know about the son,
right?
But
you get the sense that maybe the son isn't quite so
forgiving,
quite so generous.
But Miranda clearly, understands the particular context and when this happened, right? And that somebody had to win, and that she's that if Rodrigo's going to die, this is a way that he would want to die.
Yeah. And that actually, Miranda and Jahan had, watched the duel together.
Yes. That they
interesting last
kind of supported one another in that way, right? So again, an important, and it's another example of the nature of friendships in this novel, right? That they represent really. Kay represents friendships between women and between men, but also between men and women. And that friendship is kind of at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, which I really like, and I really like actually that there is this kind of sense that there is some romantic tension between Jahan and Rodrigo, but that it ultimately doesn't go anywhere because it's very clear that he's in love with his wife.
Yes.
And but that that happens, but they all stay very good friends.
Yes, despite the death of Rodrigo, right? They maintain this relationship with Miranda,
right? And that there's not that despite the fact that there could be an argument for various people having feelings of jealousy that none of them really seem to have. It's quite nice. It
doesn't invade and destroy those friendships, right? That jealousy doesn't become the motivation behind further conflict between them. I find particularly the older characters like Jahan and Miranda and Rodrigo and Amar, this sort of judiciousness behind them, right? Like there's sort of this understanding that the world. There's all of these things happen in the world, right? You might have particular feelings for someone in a way, but you understand that acting on them, stupid, right?
Yeah,
right. And so you can acknowledge that you have those feelings, but that a better way to live your life is to simply be platonic friends with this person instead, and that these relationships are what's going to make your world okay.
Yeah.
Right. These friendships are going to be the way that you get through these difficulties. That's going to, and the people that make stupid decisions that act on those things, those people are often, you see the paths that they take down them, right? That lead to their destruction in various ways.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of it's interesting, yeah, is that there is this kind of mockery of these figures who, maybe are letting their emotions carry them away too much. That there are these Christians who, it turns out, there's some commander Nino who has been having an affair with the queen. And there's this kind of excellent bit where we find out it's Jahan is like in the mountains imitating the queen and Queen Furuella, and in a very sexually explicit manner, crying out for him. And that this is one of the things that, his kind of like anger and embarrassment over this whole situation is ultimately what makes it possible to defeat him.
Yes, Rodrigo is very aware of the fact that this is a relationship, and so he plays that against these emotions against that man, and who is very soundly defeated when he probably shouldn't have been.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting that it's that, at least, and there's a sense of, I think, of some of these perhaps kind of ideas about honor and reputation as motivating factors, maybe being something that for the people who are the most sympathetic characters, not actually being what matters most.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, those are present, but for them, there are other motivating factors behind that are more important to them, right? That these relationships they have with other people, that's important.
Yeah. So at this point, I think we can move into the vera et falso section, which when I do more pure historical fiction, is a kind of what did we get right or what did we get wrong. For something like this, I'm going to be kind of thinking of it more as what directly maps onto the medieval past, what gets adapted or altered, and what perhaps are some of the reasons behind this, especially because I think Kay is somebody who actually did research.
Yes.
As opposed to some things that I watch or read where I'm like, you maybe read the Wikipedia article on this.
Or they read some really terrible popular history book that was written by someone who read the Wikipedia article on it.
Right. Exactly. So in this case, I think we could actually assume that when there are things that get altered, I think we can kind of assume that they are altered deliberately and that it represents some kind of choice about the narrative.
Yes. Yeah. That he's doing it out of pragmatic reasons rather than because he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah. And so especially kind of thinking of this, as this work that kind of exists in that space, right, of something that's not quite historical fiction, but that clearly is drawing on the real past. I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit about what your experiences have been, because you have taught this book before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've taught this book twice, actually, in 2 iterations of my medieval Spain survey course. I have used historical fiction in other courses that I've taught, and more historical fiction. And it was really problematic. Partially it's because of the books I chose, but also it just didn't work, right? But the reason why I thought this book would be better is because it is historical fantasy, right? So one is well done. I think that's partially right. I mean, there are lots of historical fantasy that isn't well done. But 2, it allows the students to think about, okay, so here we have this book that you can kind of map into medieval Spanish history, right? There's lots of things that are that you can see the connections between. It's very clear, those connections. But you can also see where Kay has deliberately made choices to not follow that history. And so for me, it helped them think a lot more about why he would have made those choices, right? What are some of the motivations behind that? But also, what do we do when we have a book or a film or a television show that's set in the medieval period that is reflective of actual events and people that lived in the medieval past? How do we approach that, and what are the questions that we need to ask? And this book is particularly, I think, useful for thinking about medieval Spanish history because it does highlight 2 of the key themes in medieval Spanish history, convivencia and reconquista, right? That were conquest and this idea of interfaith relationships. And so it works really, really well for getting students to think about how do these play out with actual human beings?
Yeah.
Right. Because they read about this in the historical documents, and they read about this in the secondary sources written by historians, but actually understanding how it played out, I think can be hard, right? How does this really work in practice, this type of thing? And so I think that's one of the things I really like about this book, is that it gets the students to think about, okay, if there are human beings living in this moments where we see these things happening, how does that play out in practice, right? What happens when these people have to make these choices and have to think about all these different influences on them and the complicated nature of that? I think this book is so good at showing them that. And so that's partially why I chose it, was because I wanted them to think about those things. And I've done a few different things with it. One year when I taught the class, I actually had them, for their final projects, they had to pick aspects of this book that relate to medieval Spanish history. And then their projects were based on that.
Okay.
So I had, I had some really interesting projects where they looked at Judaism and medicine, and they looked at, actually a lot of students that year did projects related to women's history, because women are so prominent in this book. Yeah. They were really interested in that, right? So they looked at queenship, and they looked at women's economic activities, and they looked at concubinage and all these different things. So that was really, really, really fun. Teaching historical fiction and historical fantasy can be very rewarding, both for students and for you as a professor. But you have to be careful about what you choose. Yeah. And a historical fantasy novel works better, especially one that's well written, that's well done.
Yeah. And I think your point about the kind of thinking about this through the lens of the experiences of real human beings is one that's especially well taken, especially in terms of thinking about the real messiness, right? That and the fact that, there are a lot of these figures who are kind of crossing interfaith boundaries in various ways. And of course, one interesting real life example of that in some ways is, of course, the figure of El Cid, who is the figure that Rodrigo de Belmonte is based on.
Yes, fair. And I mean, El Cid's such a fascinating character historically, because there's El Cid, the created El Cid in the poem of El Cid, and then there's the Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, right? That El Cid. And so one of the things I like about this is that Rodrigo Belmonte has elements of both, right? Like there's lots of the created fictional El Cid, and then there's parts of the sort of what we actually know about him as a human being is in there too. But yeah, I mean, Kay is, of all the figures in the book, he's the one that is most clearly connected to a historical figure.
Yes, yeah, which in very clear ways, but I will say one of the things that jumped out at me in terms of that is so that one of the things, of course, that he is famous for is that in real life, but also this is something that shows up in the Poema de Mio Cid as well, is the fact that he does spend some amount of his life fighting for the Emir of Zaragoza as a mercenary. There's a sense that, he doesn't want to fight against his own king, but he's fine with fighting against other Christians.
Yes. Yeah.
In the service of a Muslim king. And so I appreciated that element. The one thing that I will say is that, of course, I think Kay wanted to create a character that I at least like more than I like El Cid personally.
Yes.
Yes. And one particular thing I will note is that, so I don't believe we know anything about Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, just opinions about Jews.
No.
And the only reference to Jews that we have in the poem is this episode where essentially he decides it will be great and funny to cheat two Jewish moneylenders out of quite a bit of money.
Yes, he plays this trick on them in this poem, which is really described very uncritically, right? Like this is just a normal thing that you do, that you give these Jewish moneylenders boxes of sand instead of
and it seems even a sort of positive, look how clever the Cid is in the context of the poem.
And so that, and I think it's hard for us to know, because the poem has its own history in terms of how it's been written and why and all that stuff. But we don't really get any sense of how he thinks about these about the Jews in particular. I mean, obviously he's working for Muslim leaders, so clearly he must be okay with that kind of thing,
right.
being under the power of a Muslim king. But yeah, we don't really learn about that. But the Rodrigo Belmonte in the novel is very much a man of tolerance, right?
Yes, yeah, that he's so nice.
Yes. Yeah. He just always seems to know the right thing to say to everybody, right? Like,
he just seems like such a lovely man,
yes.
which, but like even reading El Cid, he's interesting. Yeah. Such a lovely man is not the impression I come away with personally.
No. When you read about El Cid, you read about someone who, I'm not sure that he's someone that I would actually want to spend time with. No. But Rodrigo Belmonte, I'd quite happily sit down and have a glass of wine with and chat. He seems like someone that would be nice to talk to.
Yeah. And it probably is also the case that I would think Ammar ibn Khayran also seems perhaps a bit more likable than his real life antecedent as well, who is, from what I could tell, seems to probably be a figure called Muhammad ibn Ammar, also a poet, shows up in Seville in 1053, ends up becoming a court poet, is very possibly involved in a sexual relationship with the prince, who then becomes king. But he, in contrast with this book, which really emphasizes the fact that he, even when he's being arguably quite mistreated, maintains some amount of loyalty. That in this, he basically kind of keeps leading the armies in a number of sort of ill-fated and probably ill-advised battles, eventually captures Murcia and declares himself an independent king with the support of Berenguer II of Barcelona.
Yes.
Gets overthrown, eventually does get captured by al-Mutamid, this prince that he had at some point, perhaps, in fact, that they had perhaps once been lovers, who captures him, throws him into prison, and eventually just beheads him.
Yes, yeah, a little different story from the Ammar in the novel. So yeah, I think I wonder too is that El Cid is so well known as a figure outside of history, right? I mean, a lot of people, at least if they have some interest in history, if you say the name El Cid, they'll know something about him. Whereas Muhammad ibn Ammar is, really not very well known. Yeah, not a household name. And so for him, I think Kay felt a bit more that he could be more, could change his story
flexible.
More, right? Yeah, more flexible. And nobody would really say anything because they wouldn't. Right. I'm sure that if he presented Belmonte in a very negative way, right, there might have been a very different response.
Right. And with El Cid too, I will say also, just in terms of him being to some extent a household name, that is of course also in part of and because of the Charlton Heston movie.
Yes. Yeah. So again, there's also there's multiple layers to how El Cid has been represented. And so he's known not only obviously in Spain, but also to North American audiences as well because of the Charlton Heston and also the very recent series on the legend of El Cid.
Yes. Yeah. Which I still need to make myself watch at some point.
I haven't watched all of it yet. It's better than I thought it would be. Okay. Particularly because again, the female characters seem much more interesting than in some cases. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I didn't find that to be especially well done in the Charlton Heston El Cid film. So.
No, despite it being Sophia Loren, she couldn't save that.
No. I mean, she does a great job with what she is given. But
yes, yeah, very much so.
The central character, who of course has, I would say, less of an obvious real life antecedent, is Jahan.
Yes.
Who, according to, the obviously completely valid source of Wikipedia, is inspired by Rebecca of York, who's not even a real person, but a fictional character from Ivanhoe and is in England.
Yes. Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, maybe that's the case, but it seems like a stretch.
Right. So there doesn't seem to be, I would say, a completely obvious basis. But there are, of course, real life Jewish women doctors that are referred to. There's actually an ethical will from a rabbi in Cologne, Yehuda ben Asher, who's father actually had been based in the Iberian Peninsula for a long time, who refers to the fact that he was treated for an eye issue by a Jewish woman doctor, and that it's actually only because of her that he wasn't completely blind.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so that's fascinating. What a great source.
And in our own home turf of the Crown of Aragon, there is also, are a number of references to Jewish women who worked as physicians, including one woman, Floretta Sanoga, who in 1381 is described as having referred 15 florins for treating the queen for some ailment.
Yeah, so there's some historical precedent in having this, a kindith doctor, right? A Jewish woman doctor, which I think that most audiences would not expect.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which I really did appreciate that, and the fact that, there are these real life antecedents, even if there's not a single figure who we know enough about for her having been the basis for a character like Jahan. I appreciated that. And I will note, of course, one of the things that is, that's very nice in the book is that she is university trained.
Yes.
Which that is the big thing that, would have been very different for Jewish women, or for that matter, Jewish male physicians, because neither Jews nor women were able in general to attend universities and train formally as physicians.
No, I mean, there's some universities in Italy that allow women to listen to lectures, but they're not allowed to get the formal training that men get, which is why they're often dismissed as real, in quotation marks, medical practitioners, particularly as the Middle Ages continues. But certainly their skills and their ability is sought by many different people.
Yeah, and it's clear that it is, that they're trained. It's just, it's a very practical training. It's essentially they're trained via apprenticeships.
Yeah, often by family members. But
so that element too, of course, that she's following her father's footsteps seems realistic to me as well.
That she had this apprenticeship under him, who's a renowned, and the fact that she's such a good doctor, right? I think is reflective of that training.
Yeah. And so actually, I'd love to talk a little bit more about this question of how Kay portrays women and, to what extent that kind of maps onto medieval realities versus to what extent it's, maybe in some ways kind of a little more positive.
Yeah. So I think in this world that he's constructed, on the one hand, there's this kind of ideological representation about women that is very similar to these kind of ideological representations of women in the Middle Ages, right? That women are inferior, that they're inferior intellectually and physically and emotionally, that they shouldn't be trusted for these. So that ideology is kind of present, this patriarchal ideology. But at the same time, he presents us with a world where there doesn't really seem to be limitations for women that seek them, right? Their limitations on their lives are not because of their gender, but because of their religion or their socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
You had already brought up the example of the fact that, Jahan's a doctor. She wouldn't have had access to going to university really in the medieval period. But one of the reasons why I like this novel is that he shows that there were lots of options for women in his world and also in medieval Europe, right? Like, I think it really challenges this belief that in the Middle Ages, women didn't do anything, right? They stayed home, they had children, they were wives and mothers. And if they weren't wives and mothers, then they were the servants of their families who had children. But Kay, shows women in these really dynamic roles and doing lots of different things, right? Not just doctors, but they're queens and they're concubines and they're doctors and they're prostitutes and they're working in the market. And they do all kinds of things in public, which is something that's often is a misrepresented belief of the medieval period, that women are in the domestic spaces in the home.
Right. And in terms of films set in the Middle Ages, I mean, I often talk about the princess or prostitute phenomenon. That's really basically what you have in most movies set in the Middle Ages, that the vast majority of women you see are one of those two things, right? They're royalty or high nobility and have either power or not in that particular context, or they're prostitutes. Of course, those women existed, but I appreciate that there are other examples of things that women can do and be that, as I said, do, map onto some of the realities of what were, not universal certainly, but were options for women in the medieval past.
Yeah. And I think that this is really good. This book is really good at showing that, right? Showing people that women did have options. So obviously, there in the real medieval period, there were limitations on their options, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women didn't have a formal education in the way that men did, or didn't have access to it in the way that men did. Women didn't necessarily always have these ability to act politically in the ways that some of these women do, but Kay at least shows you that these things were possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And
That women could potentially do these things.
Yeah. So one of the things that Kay does, which is very obviously a deliberate choice, which does not entirely map onto the real historical past, is that he really speeds up the timeline. That the book covers what, in terms of their real world analogs, it would be the Caliphate of Cordoba, and the fall of the Caliphate of Cordoba in 1031 goes into, we're at some point kind of getting into like the early Christian conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. We're including the Crusades in 1096, and the Crusade Rhineland massacres are implied in the Surenica massacre. But then by the time the book ends, it's over, right? I mean, we've had the conquest of Granada, I guess. It's 1492.
Yeah, and we're all at the end. It's all wrapped up in like 30 or 40 years, essentially, I think.
Right, because it's the very least we know it's all in the lifetime of Amr ibn Khayran, because he's the one who assassinates the last caliph, and that he's still alive and relatively spry by the end of the book in this period, which in real life is, 450 years.
Yes. Yeah. I think my sense is that it's about, he's probably in his 20s when it first starts. And then maybe early 20s when it first starts. There's a sense that he's quite young. And then by the end, he's, probably in his 60s, maybe. That seems to be the because he's walking with a stick, right? So so all of this takes place. So this 450 year is kind of compressed into this very, very short timeline.
Yeah, which I found really interesting. I see why narratively it makes sense, in that the arc sort of has to end with the fall of al-Rassan.
Yeah.
And that we kind of have then this lament that he's giving at the end.
He's
and
writing.
And that I can see how it'd be sort of unsatisfying, where it'd be like, well, I mean, they've conquered a bunch of cities, but things are kind of still going. There's still this one kingdom in the south.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because, he has done because his discussion of Byzantium, for example, is done over 3 novels, actually, the Saracen Mosaic. And so he could have made that choice, right? Let's tell this story over several generations.
Right.
Maybe the first novel is this group of people, and then the next novel can be kind of the children of, which he's done before. So I think that could have been a possibility. And also I think, because that kind of the end part of it seems really rushed, right?
It does. The epilogue.
Yeah. So I think I would have preferred that he maybe had because then that would have been a great story, right? The story of Alvar and Maria's children, and of Rodrigo's son, and in this reconquest, and I think that would have been a great story too. I think he does it though because people associate medieval Spanish history with that conquest of Granada, right? And so if he's going to write a novel about a fictionalized medieval Spain, he had to have that end as part of it. Again, unless he did a several book series.
And I do get the choice. It's one that it would have been nice if he hadn't done that, just because I think, as somebody who works on later medieval Iberia, right, and I work on the 13th, 14th centuries mostly, I think one of the things that's really interesting is the fact that it's not this, overnight or single lifetime transformation.
Yes.
It's this very long period where, you see this continued messiness. I mean, there's a ton of work still about there being, mercenaries from the kingdom of Granada, who in the 14th century are fighting for the Christian crown of Aragon. And so Hussein Fancy's book, for example, that that I think it is interesting that this is a system that continues, right? That we don't just, and that, Muslim peasants are continue to, live and be, relatively tolerated in these kingdoms that are becoming Christian, but when there are still Muslim kingdoms around, this is something that's happening for a really long time.
Yeah, and he's, I mean, he's set up this novel in thinking about what's going on in al-Rassan as this place of all of those complexities, right, of interfaith relationships. He's really done a great job of constructing that world. So I think it would have been really great to continue to explore those complexities, to think about, well, what happens when the Jadites then become the ones that are pushing this conquest and are conquering these areas. You know, when you have these Asherite peasants, when you have these cities where there are Kindith and Jadite and Asherites living together, but the Jadites are in control, right? Like that. Yeah. I think it would have been, I would have liked to see that, what that would have been like, to see how it's different, right? That, yeah. And again, that's something he does so well in this series that he does on Byzantium, is he shows the shifting and changing about what happens over this longer period. So I think that it would have benefited it. The other thing that I find really problematic about it is, you know, there's this belief amongst certain people that what happens in Spain, this conflict between Muslims and Christians, is a conflict that is a single narrative, right? That you know, the Muslims conquer Spain in 711 and the Christians are pushed up to the north. And then there's this great figure of Pelayo, the legendary Pelayo, who defends the Christians. And that from Pelayo till Isabel and Ferdinand in 1492, that this is like an unbroken attempt at reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from and also, of course, the term reconquering itself, right, is implying that this all then goes back and kind of links directly to the Visigothic past. Yes. Yeah. So that there's this connection, and unfortunately that this book kind of perpetuates that belief, right? Because of that speeded up timeline and the fact that we see the same people kind of in charge of this, that perpetuates that idea, right? That this is not a series of wars, but it is one war. And then, of course, also that it's interesting because then it kind of sets up in that it's not entirely clear, I believe, from the end precisely what is happening with the Asherites and the Kindith, who are now in the fully Jadite-ruled Iberian Peninsula. Of course, in, you know, historical reality, what happens is that relatively soon after the conquest of Granada, the Jews are expelled, and relatively, and, you know, and 10 years after, the Muslims are expelled as well. We lose that, and in part, it's, I think it makes sense in some ways that they don't mention it in this book, because the sped up timeline would almost make that seem bizarre. Yes. Yeah, it would, because why would that happen, right? They're like, oh, so they're, and it's interesting because in his other novels, so the one that he just published recently on late medieval, it's like 15th century Italy, you hear about some things happening in Esperanza. So he does, that's one of the things I like. It's the same world, essentially, right? Yeah. So that's one of the things I like about his books, is that he always makes reference to the other things that are happening, right? And so he does kind of talk a little, and I can't remember the details of exactly what he says, but he does mention things happening in España, right? That there's stuff going on there that is brought up in the narrative of, because of course they're involved in these wars, these Italian wars, right? Yeah, and it would be interesting, and he certainly could still, I think, write a sequel, which is, you know, what is happening in España after a couple of centuries of Jadite rule, and you know, I mean, then that things obviously I think would be different without there being still the Kingdom of Granada, but that of course, you know, with the exception of this one kingdom, most of the Iberian Peninsula is under Christian control from the 13th century onwards. Yeah, I mean, I would love to have a sequel to this, right? To see where he would go with it. Yeah. So I think some of these conversations that we've had about these, the kind of relationships of the three faiths can lead into what I wanted to do for the Historia et Veritas segment, where I get into a real historical event or phenomenon. Here, I'd really like to take the opportunity, because I haven't had it before, given just what movies and books are out there, to talk about the concept of convivencia. Sure. Yeah. So convivencia is a term that's been it started in the early 20th century, and it essentially means this idea of Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together in medieval Spain. And the implication is that they're living together more or less harmoniously. Right. I would say in terms of the way the term
was used by many scholars, and certainly the ways in which the term has then become imported into a more popular lexicon, the assumption tends to be that, that convivencia means a kind of, basically a kind of interfaith, almost utopian harmony.
Yes. Yeah. That here we have, unlike anywhere else in medieval Europe, in Spain, we have Muslims, Christians, and Jews that all live together in harmony, regardless of whether Muslims are in charge or Christians are in charge, right? That they all kind of live together. The height of it, of course, is under Muslim control, but that they all kind of live together in this harmonious way with only minor conflict. Right, that happens, but there's all these wonderful things that there's collaboration intellectually and culturally and economically. There's all these collaborations together, and that this is what makes Spain unique, is the argument that's made.
Right. And of course, one of the things that I think has been really interesting in some recent scholarship is scholarship kind of pointing out some of the ways in which, to the extent that there is cooperation and intercultural connectivity between these three faiths, that's not something that's unique to Spain or to the Iberian Peninsula, that this is something that we can really see in certainly between Jews and Christians in Northern Europe. It's something that we can see in the Middle East at various points. There has definitely been this really interesting challenge to this idea of kind of uniqueness of, to use the term that I think was on like Franco's promotional tourism materials, Spain is different.
Yes. Yeah. That we need to bring a discussion of medieval Iberia's interfaith relationships into a broader discussion of interfaith relationships across the medieval world, right? Not just in Northern Europe, but also around the Mediterranean, and to, compare what's happening in Spain to what's happening in Constantinople, what's happening in North Africa, what's happening in Southern Italy, right? That there's these relationships are happening elsewhere too.
And then, of course, the other piece of this is that, the idea in the earlier scholarship and in these popular works that have talked about this is, again, this kind of essentially utopian atmosphere. Conflict as being something that's very minor and very occasional. So it's, I think another really important scholarly trend is scholarship that's thinking about the presence of interfaith polemic, the presence of hostilities, the fact that, and yes, massacres are anomalous, but they're also arguably anomalous as opposed to constant in most other places as well. That there is this conflict that's happening between in various forms of conflict, right? That there's systemic violence in different parts of Iberia. There's sort of there's other forms of pressures that are placed upon these minority groups to make life really uncomfortable for them. Right.
Girona that we both study deals with this in the late 14th and early 15th century. It has the pogroms that happen across Spain in 1391 there as well. But then a period after that, in the early 15th century, from about 1414 into the 1420s, the Jews there are really targeted by Christian authorities, not through violence, but through other means, right? Through economic pressure and through pressure to convert and these other types of things that create crises for these communities, right? So there are these other types of conflict that are not necessarily violent.
And of course, real efforts to create and reinforce religious hierarchies and boundaries in a variety of ways. One big way that a number of scholars have talked about are sexual boundaries, that it's very telling that Christian laws tend to emphasize it being a problem for Christian women to have sex with Jewish or Muslim men much more than vice versa.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's because of, these desires for the religious hierarchy should be mapping onto the gender hierarchy, right?
Yeah. It's okay for Christian men to have these relationships with Muslim or Jewish women, provided these are not marital relationships.
Right. Yes.
But, Christian man going to having a sexual relationship, an informal sexual relationship with a woman of a minor faith is they're like, well, you really shouldn't do that, but they're not really going to do anything about it. Whereas if it was a Christian woman, that woman and her partner would also get into big trouble. Yeah.
Right. And in some places, potentially as far as being executed.
Yes.
And then, of course, things like I was actually just the other day reading some of the Barcelona urban regulations talking about requirements in the 14th century that Jews wear various kind of distinguishing items of clothing, right? They're supposed to be either a kind of yellow or red cape, or that if you aren't wearing the cape, then you can have kind of attach a yellow circle to your exterior clothing.
Yeah. And you see that in many urban regulations in cities across Spain in the late medieval period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that there are these kind of real ways in which there are moments in which difference is constantly being reinscribed, which boundaries are being created, and in which hierarchies are being emphasized. That for Christians, that Jews and Muslims are inferior. That for Muslims, Jews and Christians are inferior, and Jews never have enough power to be able to do anything about that, but they certainly have their own, religious polemics that are targeting certainly Christians and occasionally Muslims as well.
Yeah. So those markers of difference being emphasized as well.
Yeah.
Within a hierarchical way. I think that's really important too.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that is interesting about the term convivencia itself is that it, of course, has this history, but that its literal meaning is just living together. And I think that to the extent that it can be salvaged, it would be to kind of think about it in its literal sense, right? That they are living together. That doesn't mean they're always living together harmoniously, but they are living together for a very long time.
Yeah. And I mean, and much like a family lives together, or you live together with roommates, right? Sometimes you get along and sometimes you don't get along. Yeah. And so there's these conflicts that arise, but there's also moments where there's these individual relationships show that they are getting along and they are supporting each other in different ways. And I think that's the important thing to think about in terms of how we explore interfaith relationships in medieval Spanish history is that we need to think about those individual relationships alongside these broader systemic institutional relationships at the same time, that both can exist in the space at the same time.
Yeah. And that is, I think, one of the things that's really interesting about this book is that it has such an emphasis on these individual relationships.
Yes. Yeah. While also showing these broader systemic intolerance that's happening too, right? At the same time, that both of these exist together.
Yeah. And if I can do something of an anti-plug in this section in terms of talking about, maybe how not to complicate or challenge the idea of convivencia, I think it is worth mentioning that there is a relatively recent book by Dario Fernandez Morera, who is not actually a specialist in the medieval Iberian Peninsula or the interfaith relations thereof. He is, I believe, a scholar of Golden Age Spanish poetry.
Yeah, Cervantes in particular.
And published this book, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, which I actually discovered because a bunch of my students cited it, and they said things in their papers, and I said, where did you get this from?
Yeah.
And followed their footnotes, and that's where they got that from. And then I read many reviews of this book, and then I gave a lecture about how maybe you should look at the publisher, and if they are coming out from a press that explicitly says that their goal is to promote conservative values on American campuses, maybe that's not the book to use.
Yeah. In my medieval Spain class, I actually, in the very first lecture, what we do is I talk about Ornament of the World by Maria Menocal, which really highlights this sort of this harmonious convivencia, right? This idyllic period. And I talk about that. And then I compare it to Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, which is completely the opposite. And what I do is I use them together to get my students to think about when you have these works that present only one picture.
Yeah.
That's when you should be questioning the picture that they're presenting. That history is complicated. And if this is a book that's not presenting a complicated story, then there's something wrong with it, particularly when dealing with interfaith relationships, right? But look at the publisher, look at the reviews of the book are really fascinating to read because popularly this book has got, I mean, obviously white supremacists have picked it up. And because
it very much has an axe to grind against Muslims in particular. That's very much the point, is in particular the claim that there was any kind of interfaith harmony under Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula is categorically wrong is his argument.
Yes, is completely erroneous. And so the book is a good example of what can happen when an academic who writes about a period he really knows nothing about, but who writes from a very specific political agenda, where that can become, and this book is available in university libraries all. Yeah. I mean, my library has it. And so I actually, when I teach medieval Spain now, I have on the syllabus, do not use this book. I specifically state it because so many of my students did the same, right? They saw it. Yeah. It's in the library. They assume that it's an okay book to use, and it's not, right? Yeah, it's actually at some point at least was listed. If you go to the Wikipedia page for either Muslim Spain or al-Andalus, whatever is the title of the Wikipedia page, it's listed as one of the main reference works that you should consult. Which every now and then I'm like, I should edit it and take it out, but I'm like, somebody's just going to put it back in. Put it back in again. Yeah. And this is the thing, right? This particular, and I think it's important. I think your point that they look at who's publishing it is because when I don't remember how I found out about it. Someone must have, I bet a student referred to it and so I went and looked at it the same, right? Yeah. And I looked at the publisher and I went, wait a minute. What's going on here? But again, it's I think that's the problem, right? These extremes, right? The extreme convivencia is this idyllic utopia that's different from everywhere else is really problematic in a different way, I think, to this type of representation that's happening. Yeah. But it's a problem that these books are being represented as actually reflecting medieval Spain. And this is why I think novels like The Lions of al-Rassan are so good, because they show those complexities, right? They show students that it is complicated, but you can understand a story even if it's complicated. And I think that's also kind of a good, it can function as a good lead in too, in terms of encouraging students to find a great deal of excellent scholarship that is being produced on this topic. And because that's one of the other problems with Fernandez Morera's book, is that he creates something of a straw man in that he implies that, Menocal and a couple other very kind of popularly focused history books, including many of which are not by, professional academics, that he presents that as if that's the state of the field, which at the time when the book was written in 2015, 2016 was very much not the case. Yes. Yeah. In many ways, his book is very dated, right? Because the historiography, so the work by professional historians that he discusses is work that's old. Yeah. Right. Menacal's book came out in 2001. Right. And even that book is interesting in that, Menacal is a scholar of this period, but Ornament of the World is a book that is somewhat more popularly geared, or that's geared somewhat more toward a popular audience. Yeah. And she wanted to present a particular representation of this period. And there's been so much amazing work done on interfaith relationships in medieval Spain, between that time, between 2001 and when Morera's book was published, that there's a huge body of work he could have drawn from. Yeah. But again, he doesn't want to tell that story, right? To him, this is a story of Muslims as evil, as violent, as intolerant. And so that's the story that I'm going to tell. And I'm just going to ignore all of this other. But he also goes on these long diatribes about those historians who tell that story, which when you get to that should kind of say to you, wait a minute. Right. So, so I guess that's kind of an anti-plug for that. But yes, I think in some ways, again, another plug for The Lions of al-Rassan, in that, despite the fact that it is obviously a work of fiction and of fantasy, I think it's not perfect, but I think it does a more responsible job of depicting convivencia and of depicting interfaith relations in the Iberian Peninsula than some other books that one could read. Yeah, very much so. And again, because it deals with these human relationships, I think it helps people see them in a very different way. Yeah. And understand how they worked, right? Think about the person on the street. Like I'm sure you feel the same way when I'm in Spain, particularly when I'm in Girona with its preserved medieval city. I think about the fact that, the women that I'm reading about in the archives were walking on these streets, and what would it have been like for them to walk along these streets where they are meeting Christians and Jews and other Jews here, right? Like what would that have been like? And I think that the lines of al-Rassan helps you kind of picture that a bit more.
Yeah, to think about, the fact also that people can be complicated, right? That there are these people who, on the one hand, have these loyalties in some ways to these kind of ideas about faith and conquest, but that doesn't take away necessarily from the fact that they also have these interpersonal connections that are meaningful with people who belong to other faiths.
Yeah, and I think it's more reflective of the historical sources that we read.
Yeah, absolutely. The Fabula Nostra section, which I'd like to get into next, is where typically I have us imagine a film or show in some way inspired by this one. Or sometimes for books, I just suggest that we can kind of, talk about casting, which I'll be honest, I actually tried to do, and I really struggled finding actors who I felt like fit our three central characters.
Yes, me too. Yeah, I did as well. That would have been true to them in the way that they're created. Right.
Yes. So I'm all for making this movie, but I don't know. Hopefully, we'll find some excellent unknown actors out there if we do.
Yeah, well, they have, there has been rumors since 2005 that this is going to be made into a movie. So Warner Brothers actually bought the rights to this book to create a movie in 2005. And apparently I thought, I haven't heard anything about it lately. So I went and looked, and apparently it's still very slowly moving, but it is moving. So who knows? We may see a movie of this at some point in time. Maybe they're having the same problems with casting that we are.
Right. Yeah. So I hope they are successful. I think it could be really excellent.
I think so too.
So yes. So I did come up with a just kind of like kernel, at least, of an idea of something totally different, but in some ways inspired by this. I think if I were going to do the kind of fantastical representation of some sort of real historical event, I would love to do something inspired by the Berenguer Ramon II's alleged murder of his twin brother Ramon Berenguer II in the county of Barcelona.
Yes, I told my students that story when I was teaching medieval Spain. Yeah. First of all, they love the fact that the brothers just have flipped names.
Yes, hilarious.
that. But yeah, I think that would be a really dramatic, kind of wonderful story to tell. I was trying to think about what I would want to tell. I think that because there hasn't really been a well done representation of this, I think looking at something like the city of Valencia during the time of in the time of the plague. So Valencia is in the process of becoming the leading city in the Crown of Aragon at the time, and there's a war that's going on between the King Pere and these Valencian nobles, and he's having other wars as well. And then the plague happens, and that whole the war stops, and then eventually he wins, and he says he's going to raise the city to the ground, right, and sow it with salt. But I think there's so much drama in that particular in those moments as well. I think would be the other thing too is I think I'd be fascinated to see a movie done on the life of Leonor Lopez de Cordova, whose memoir is really a story of a noblewoman whose family is caught up in the Civil War, who experiences the plague, who wants to become a nun. And like, there's all these things that happen in her life. So I think that her story would also be a really dramatic film too.
Yeah, definitely. I also, it's inspired by, this will be an episode coming out soon after this one that I have been, at the time of recording, watching Cathedral of the Sea, which I have complicated feelings about, which I will talk about elsewhere. But I do think that, just thinking about the film, that this is a real position, that, the consul of the sea as a leading figure of Barcelona, I feel like that term is just meant for a fantasy novel.
Yes. Yeah. I think, well, and that's the one thing about the Lines of al-Rassan is it really doesn't deal with the Crown of Aragon very much at all, right? Most of the players in this novel are essentially Castilian or from Navarre, right? I think the kingdoms are Navarre, Leon, and Galicia is the three in this novel. And the Crown of Aragon doesn't really play a role at all. And so I'd love to see And I wonder too if it's a little complicated. So maybe, but and also not quite going anywhere at this point. But and I'd love to see a novel set there, right?
Yeah,
in that historical thing, because there's so much cool stuff that happens. In how the Crown of Aragon is created, and in Jaume's conquest of these areas. And I think that'd be another great fantasy. And also, the royal women in the Crown of Aragon play all these really cool.
There's so many interesting figures.
So that I think would be great too.
Yeah, of course, we're both biased since we are both, of course, historians of the Crown of Aragon.
Crown of Aragon. Yeah, only slightly.
Right. Everybody should do more movies and books based on our research.
Yes.
So this week we can move into rating the book on a scale from 1 to 5 based on whatever idiosyncratic criteria we see fit. And I think I'm going to go with like a 4.25 out of 5.
Yeah, I would say I'm in that I was like a 4.2 to a 4.5, I would say, around that, because I think there's something, there's some stereotypes that happen in this book, and there's some stuff that's a little that bothers me, but overall I think if you want someone to read a historical fantasy book set in a medieval period, it's a good book to read.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spent a lot of time covering a lot of things for this podcast that are far less historically responsible while claiming more overt historicity than this book. So
yeah. And I think, I think Kay is a model of how, if you're a novelist and you're going to write about the historical past, this is how you do it, right?
Yeah.
You do the research, you do the work, but also you set it in an alternate world that allows you to take those liberties, but you're responsible with those liberties too. I think.
You're thoughtful about it. They seem deliberate. And I will also say that this does pretty well on gender-related considerations, as we've talked about. I have a test for this podcast, the ifft test, where there has to be at least one named woman who doesn't die, which this book passes with flying colors.
Yes. Yeah.
And I believe even passes the Bechdel test. There is a conversation that Jahan has with the prostitutes.
Yes. Yeah, that's not about, yeah, very much so.
And and I don't remember their names, but they are named.
Yes, they're all named. That's the other thing too, right? Is that even these characters that are minor, they all have names. Female characters, they're all named. So I think if you're going to talk about gender, this is a good book to think about the possibilities for women in the medieval period. Yeah,
absolutely. Can wrap up at this point. So Dana, are there places where the listeners could find you on the internet if they would like to do so?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Dane History. That's the best way to find me there. And I'm in the process of creating a website for my own work, but I haven't quite got that done yet. So
Twitter's the way to go.
Yeah, Twitter's the way to go. And then once I know I'll share that on Twitter.
And of course, many excellent published articles that people should absolutely seek out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you look under my name and Alexandra Garrison, you can learn all kinds of things about Jewish women and conversas in the late 14th and early 15th century in Catalonia. And they're good things to read alongside your work.
Yeah, I mean, if I can do a double plug, there is a volume that you and Alexandra and Michelle Armstrong Fertitta edited, Women and Community in Medieval and Early Modern Iberia, which you and Alexandra have an article in, and I also have an article in. So everybody should go get that book.
Yes, and it's the co-winner of the Collaborative Publication Award from the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women and Gender for 2020.
Yes, so everybody should read that. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe in your preferred podcatcher app and rate and review Media-eval on Apple Podcasts. I'll read new 5-star reviews in future episodes. Please also follow the podcast on Twitter at Media-eval-pod and join our Facebook group. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Sarah Ifft. And finally, if you have any questions or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you via email at media.evalpod@gmail.com. Thank you, Dana, again for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for listening to Media-eval. Bye.